This document was given at a time when the Jews in Palestine were 10% of the population. In fact, within these 10%, there was a large number of Jewish community, religious communities, who were anti-Zionist and did not at all feel the need for Palestine to become a Jewish homeland. And from their religious perspective, the fact that the Palestinians were developing self-determination and independence on Palestine was very much according to God's will, and there was no need to tamper with his planning and actions on the ground. So even the 10% is a distortion of the balance, the demographic balance of power when Britain promised that Palestine would become a Jewish homeland. They promised about 5 to 7% of the people, most of whom came 10 years earlier, that they would have the country to themselves, totally ignoring the aspiration and the interests of the local people. The fact that the document promised to do it is exactly how the international community would treat the question of Palestine ever since. Words that did not reflect in any way the realities on the ground. The same discourse and dictionary of peace, of coexistence, would continue in documents, while on the ground exactly the opposite would happen. Dispossession, occupation, colonization, and eventually ethnic cleansing. The third station in this journey is the 1930s. Again, a very important chapter in history we should all remember. On the one hand, the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe drove more Jews than ever before into Palestine. Not only because of the rise of Nazism and fascism, but mainly because the other places in the world were locked and closed for Jews. So Palestine became, in many ways, not an ideological choice for the Jews of Europe, but the only possible outlet of the inferno that began to rage in Europe. The balance of power, the balance of demographic power, if you want, was still very much in favor of the indigenous native population of Palestine. The Jews, despite the mass immigration from Europe, were still only 1/3 of the population. And then again, Britain interfered in order to strengthen its support for the Zionist project, and committed itself once more to the creation of a Jewish homeland at the expense of the native population of Palestine. But this time, the Palestinians revolted and tried, first by a strike, by petition, by civil protest, to change British policy. And when this didn't help, the First Intifada, and this was really the First Intifada. The First Intifada broke out in the 1930s, led by, among others, by Izzeddin al-Qassam. The British reacted very powerfully against this revolt and destroyed both the military capacity of the Palestinians, which would be very important for understanding the events of 1948, and exiled most of the Palestinian political leaders. It undermined the political and military leadership of the Palestinians to such an extent that by the time it was really needed, in 1947, 1948, one can say without exaggeration that the Palestinians were leaderless in the 1948 events. So as you can see, in the two last stations I've mentioned, Britain plays a very important role and is responsible for the road to the Nakba, to the catastrophe. I don't think it did the catastrophe. I don't think it's responsible directly for the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948. Definitely it has no role in the continued dispossession of the Palestinians since 1948, but it did play a formative, significant role in the early stages. And Palestinians have a right to demand from Britain a very different attitude from the one they're getting it bears responsibility beyond that of many other countries in the world. And I think it's not coincidence and not an accident of history that the basic ideas for a different strategy of the West against Israel, such as the boycott idea, emanated from Britain. At least the more conscientious section of the British public opinion know that history that I'm telling you about this evening and feel obliged to act because of that history. The next station is the inevitable result of all the previous stations. Because Palestine was chosen as the place where Jews would build secure life and where they would reinvent themselves as a national movement. And because this idea was protected and aided and supported by the British government, who were the masters in Palestine until 1948, the inevitable result was that the Zionist project was built in such a way that it was much better prepared than the Palestinian side to the historical juncture of 1948. But in order to understand exactly what happened in 1948, we have to look at Zionism, and I'm simplifying it, I know, but I think it's a useful way of looking at Zionism, as a project that relied in the past and relies in the present on achievements when it comes to the Palestine issue on two levels, in two aspects. One is territorial, space, and the other one is demographic, population. If you want, geography and demography. And the Zionist leaders wrote a lot, and were actually quite preoccupied, compulsory writers, diaries and documents. So we have a lot of historical evidence for the way that they developed their ideology and concept about the Palestinians. And in these two aspects I've mentioned, Zionism of the Zionist leaders began to develop very clear ideas. Let us begin with the space, with the geography. From a very early moment in the history of the Zionist movement, it was very clear to the Zionist leaders that in order to implement the two basic objectives of what they call security and self-determination, the space that they needed was the whole of historical Palestine. They looked at the map, which was actually drawn by British officials. We all talk about historical Palestine as if we have a map of Palestine in the Bible or in the Quran or in the New Testament. There isn't a map. There isn't any borders mentioned in any of the holy books. And the Zionist movement before 1917 never had a map of Palestine. Nor did anyone in Palestine have a map of Palestine because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. But British officials needed to draw the map of Palestine, and then we called it historical Palestine, because they wanted to know which part of the Ottoman Empire would be part of the British Empire once they would win the confrontation in the First World War. And that part of the world that was called Palestine, by the time the Zionist movement arrives in Palestine as a colonialist movement, that part of Palestine that appears on the map, all of it, was deemed necessary for a successful Zionist project. And in that part lived the people who were the Palestinians, although they also lived in some other parts in the borders of historical Palestine. But the majority of the people lived in between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, and the Litani River in the north, and the Sinai Peninsula and the Red Sea in the south. 20,000 or so square kilometers. And the Zionist movement has not changed its geographical map perception ever since 1882 until today. And although there is always a feeling